terms that Putin has laid down to settle this one that I believe no American president would ever accept.
You can blame us, you can call us aggressors, imperialists, and so on, but for us, Ukraine in NATO means existential threat.
What President Biden wants is for Ukraine to lose the war on Donald Trump's watch, not on his watch.
When the people in the West say never Putin will use nuclear weapon, they are wrong.
President Trump, throughout his campaign, he has said that he's going to resolve the conflict in a matter of 24 hours. Now, I understand that may be a figurative speaking, but what is the outlook for the resolution of the conflict in Ukraine right now?
Yeah, I'll say a few words and then turn it over to Professor Dugan. There's no question that President Trump has said that the one area in the world, which is Ukraine, that he's going to really fundamentally alter American foreign policy is in that conflict. And as you said, he says he's going to shut it down very quickly. I do not believe he's going to shut it down very quickly. I believe he may have good intentions, but it's not going to happen. And the reason is that he would have to accept terms that Putin has laid down to settle this one that I believe no American president would ever accept. And specifically, Putin has said before he will even negotiate, this is to begin negotiations to come up with a peace settlement, the West, and here we're talking mainly about the United States and Ukraine have to accept two conditions. One, that Ukraine will never be in NATO, either de jure or de facto, that Ukraine will be a neutral state, a genuinely neutral state. And furthermore, that the West and Ukraine have to accept the fact that Crimea and the 4 oblasts that the Russians have now annexed are permanently lost. They're permanently part of Russia. And again, Putin is saying, before I even begin negotiations to settle this, to come up with a peace agreement, you have to accept those two conditions. I find it hard to imagine the United States, even President Trump, accepting those two conditions. I find it hard to imagine the Ukrainians accepting those two conditions. Now, one could argue that President Trump is a very special person, and he has views that are outside the mainstream, and he is, after all, the President of the United States. But the problem is that he is surrounded by people who have Russophobia in the extreme and have been super hawkish on Ukraine for years. It's not like Trump is bringing into office with him a good number of people who share his views about shutting down the Ukraine war. He's bringing into power, as is very clear, a bunch of hawks. And therefore, Trump is going to be surrounded by people who are not going to want to accept the conditions that Putin has laid out. So my view as to what's going to happen here is that this is going to be settled on the battlefield, and I believe the Russians are going to win an ugly victory. They're in the process of doing it. And at some point, you're going to get a frozen conflict, or you're going to get an armistice. And the end result is you're going to have bad relations between Russia on one side and the West and Ukraine on the other side for as far as the eye can see. I think this is a terrible situation, but I don't think that Trump is going to change things in any meaningful way and be able to come up with a meaningful peace agreement.
On my side, I can only agree totally with what Mr. Mearsheimer has said. And I would add, the situation is more radical that you have described, because the conditions put forward by Mr. Putin officially don't correspond to the real intentions of Russian Federation. So that was a kind of minimal conditions that were put put in the front, precisely because nobody could accept them on the West. So in the reality, the situation with Ukraine is much more existential and important for Russia. We could not tolerate any kind of Ukraine hostile to Russia, any versions in any borders, inside any borders. The point of agreement, consensus inside of Russia that the war will lead with the West in the Ukraine should end with our victory and nothing less. That is not just the vision of Mr. Putin. That is the condition of Putin to stay in power and to save our political regime. So that is much more than just hawkish or imperialist reactions or desires or dreams or something like that of emerging once again independent power in the Eurasia. It is much more than that. So, and I think nobody in the West understands that correctly, because for us to be or not to be as Russia, as Russian Federation, means to win or to lose the war in Ukraine. That's much more than the conditions that Putin has put forward. And Mr. Mearsheimer has very correctly explained, and I agree totally with this opinion, that these minimal and unsupportable and unacceptable conditions that Putin has put forward, they have no chance to be accepted by the future administration of Mr. Trump. With his agreement or against his will, I think there is the kind of geopolitical realist, if you want, logic that the West and United States could never, I would say, never accept not only expressed and explicit claims of Russia, but much less implicit claims of Russia that they go much more further than just keep in our possession the territories we have won or neutral status of Ukraine. So Mr. Mearsheimer has explained very well the realist balance of power in this situation, and I think as well that we need to separate in Russian understanding of Trump's administration and Trump's factor two things. First of all, Russia is in agreement. Russia supports eagerly the orientation of Mr. Trump against globalism, globalists, against cancel culture, and his fight for restoration of traditional values. All that is very well accepted in Russia. But I think in the terms of the realist geopolitics, there are so huge contradictions that I would say they stop precisely in the moment when these possible, virtual, probable negotiations start. In that moment, there will be the huge amount of misunderstanding on the deep level of the mutual understanding of the nature of the conflict in Ukraine that will prevent any possible solutions. So I agree once more with Mr. Mearsheimer that the result or the end of this bloody conflict will be decided on the battlefield. So that will be no armistice, no truce, no peace talks, but rather the weapon that will decide the fate, the destiny of these geopolitical conflicts. And that's beside, or I would say beyond a Russian great impression of Trump, because Trump is, in our eyes, he is defender of the traditional values, and we applaud that. We totally agree with that. Cancel, as Elon Musk recently has said, cancel culture should be canceled. So we should stop with this left liberal agenda on the global level. In that sense, Russia will support absolutely that. But on the term or in the realm of the realist geopolitics, I think the contradictions will not disappear, or maybe will aggravate more.
If I can just pick up on what Professor Dugan was saying and make two additional points. He used the word existential threat. And I have long argued that it is imperative from a Western perspective to understand that putting Ukraine in NATO is an existential threat from Russia's perspective. And once you accept the fact that Russia views Ukraine in NATO as an existential threat, you realize just how dangerous the situation is, and you realize that the Russians will fight to the death to prevent Ukraine from being in NATO, because it is an existential threat. It threatens their survival. The problem that you face in the West is that hardly anybody accepts that argument. And they will say that NATO expansion is not an existential threat to Russia. And they believe that what's going on here is that Putin is just an imperialist. He's an old-fashioned aggressor. He wants to create a greater Russia by incorporating Ukraine into it. And this has nothing to do with an existential threat. My argument is you may not think, you in the West may not think it's an existential threat, but what you in the West think is irrelevant. What matters is what the Russians think, and in particular, what Putin thinks. And the Russians have made it perfectly clear, in my opinion, from the very beginning, that Ukraine inside of NATO was unacceptable. It is an existential threat. Nevertheless, we continue to talk about bringing Ukraine into NATO, number one. And number two, if we don't talk about bringing Ukraine formally into NATO, we talk about creating a situation where Ukraine is a de facto member of NATO, where there's a strong security relationship between the West, especially the United States, and Ukraine. This drives the Russians crazy. They view this as an existential threat, but we refuse to accept that. And if we refuse to accept that, and we refuse to take Ukraine in NATO off the table, you're never going to get an agreement. And that's a point I think that both Professor Dugan and I agree on. The second point I would make is that the more we push to maintain a tight security relationship between the West and Ukraine, this is the de facto NATO argument, and the more we talk about a de jure relationship where Ukraine is actually brought into NATO, the more we incentivize the Russians to capture additional territory in Ukraine and to destroy Ukraine. It's completely counterproductive from Ukraine's point of view. It would be in the West's interest and in Ukraine's interest to accept the fact that Ukraine cannot become a member of NATO and go to great lengths to come up with a genuine peace agreement. But because we in the West refuse to accept the argument that the Russians make, that Ukraine and NATO is an existential threat, we continue to wave this threat in the face of the Russians. And the end result is the conflict will go on, and in the end, Ukraine will be destroyed. It will end up as a dysfunctional rump state, and it will lose a lot of its territory to Russia. And furthermore, this will be a humiliating defeat, not just for NATO, but for the West itself. So what I'm saying here is that by refusing to accept the fact that the Russians view NATO expansion into Ukraine as an existential threat, the West has basically shot itself in the foot and destroyed Ukraine in the process.
So I totally agree with that. So that is, I have remarked some years ago that the West has finished to think in the realist terms. So what is realism in the theory or practice? So you can imagine not only your position in the balance of power in the international relations, but as well you take in consideration the position of the other. So you can think this way, but the other thinks differently. As realist, you put on the balance both positions and you try to come to some rational solution. So that is maybe cynical, maybe outside of moral, but realism in the international relations precisely that. So you evaluate the real capacity, the real possibility of the other than you, and you take that in consideration in calculation of your national interests. So that was starting from Morgenthau and Carr in the international relations. That is uninterrupted line of realist thinking. And I think that Mr. Mearsheimer has explained that excellently. Everything is completely clear. If you consider Russia as an object in international relations, you could say we need to punish it, we need to put it in the border, we need to overthrow Putin and so on. But if you accept that that is not just object, but subject, so you start to consider, to explore, to study its subjective perspective. And in this subjective perspective appears precisely what Mr. Mearsheimer has absolutely clearly defined as existential threat. And that is so. So for us, you can blame us, you can call us aggressors, imperialists, and so on. But for us, Ukraine in NATO means existential threat. And Mr. Mearsheimer has said one very important thing about the fight to the death. And if the existential threat is perceived as such in the eyes by the subject of the nuclear power as Russia, the death means not only the death for Russia or for Ukraine. The death in the case of nuclear power involved means as well the possible death of the Western Europe or United States. The death means the death for everybody. So, and that is precisely what Mr. Putin wanted to emphasize some years ago when he has affirmed clearly that the world without Russia could not be tolerated by Russia. That is the nature and a deep dimension of an existential threat. If something threatens you existentially, you could prefer to destroy everything, universe, life on the earth, humanity, everybody. But you should save yourself. So the price is in the case of nuclear power with nuclear weapon capable to destroy humanity is very high. So it is maybe you can say so that is crazy, that is anti-humanist or something like that, maybe, but that is moral evaluation of what is going on. But on the level of the mutual realist understanding on what we think to be existential threats. So that we need to take that in consideration. For example, if Russia would invite Mexico in the military alliance with Russia and Mexico, and at the same time claims to restore the Texas and other ancient Spanish territories inside of United States now. So you can imagine what existential threat is it for us. I am not speaking, as Mr. Mearsheimer here, we are not speaking about moral, about liberalism, about values. We are speaking about interests. I appreciate very much, I have studied ideas of Mr. Mearsheimer about offensive realism. I completely agree with this line of thought. You could criticize that, you could accept that, but that is absolutely brilliant exposition of what is going on in the reality. And maybe I think the lack of realism will play very bad job with Trump's new administration. The realism could solve this conflict. Realist approach. When we involve the moral, liberal ideals, democratic values, and so on, we are losing the reality of the seriousness of the situation. And I think that Mr. Mearsheimer has shown brilliantly what is on the stake.
There are actually many layers of questions that I have from the conversation just now. Is that we are in agreement here. Everything is well said and heard. But how many people do you think, I suppose I would direct a question to Professor Mearsheimer first, is that how many people do you think in the United States actually understand what we are discussing here? Because it is about a world of perspectives, right? You can argue that, hey, we are a benign hegemon, there's nothing to worry about. Well, it's not about what you think, it's about what Mr. Putin, what the Russian people think. So playing in between a conflict, between a war of perspectives, and potentially with nuclear weapons at stake, how many people side with you? How many people understand your perspective in America? And also to follow up on that is that, why the recent provocation? Why the recent escalation? Calling on lowering military aid in Ukraine and allowing Ukraine to use American-made long-range missile by Biden administration right before he's about to leave the office. Why?
I think it's fair to say that hardly any Americans accept my views on the Ukraine conflict. And what really is happening here is, to use the rhetoric that Professor Dugan was using, it's almost impossible for most Americans to put themselves in the shoes of the other. In other words, American policymakers, American foreign policy elites are not good at thinking about how the Russians might view Ukraine in NATO. They have their own views, which they think are the dominant views. This is captured in a very famous comment by Madeleine Albright in the late 1990s. She said, "We are the indispensable nation. We stand taller and we see further." Just think about those comments. We, the United States, we're special, we're exceptional, we stand taller, we see further. This is all a way of saying we know what is best for everybody else. We have the approved solution. And what's really happening here is that when the Cold War ended and the United States had won this tremendous victory and ended up as the unipole, the most powerful state in the system, with this liberal ideology, we thought that we could spread liberalism all over the world, which is a way of saying we thought we had won not just geopolitically, but we had won ideologically. And we were in a position where we could cause every other state in the system to become a liberal democracy like the United States. And we were so full of confidence that we could shape the world in our image that we fell into a situation where we found it impossible to pay serious attention to what other states said. And by the way, this is not just Russia, it's China as well. The United States thought it knew what was best for China. This is what the engagement policy towards China was all about. It was to make China look like the United States. And of course, the United States wanted to make Russia look like the United States. So you had this situation which was always present in the United States. It was always there that we had some difficulty putting ourselves in the shoes of the other side, for sure. But after 1989, and certainly after the Soviet Union collapsed in December 1991, we fell into a pattern where it became almost impossible for us to strategize. Strategy is all about thinking about what the other side is thinking and what the other side will do in response to what you do. That's what strategy is all about. This is why realism is inextricably bound up with strategy. But we really, in a fundamental way, lost that ability. And therefore, when the Russians said, this is an existential threat, and they said it over and over and over, it's not like you can look at one speech where Putin said it's an existential threat to bring Ukraine into NATO. Putin said it millions of times. It's crazy. All the Russian elites said the same thing, but we refused to believe it. And it's because we believe, and I think this is still true, that we are the indispensable nation. We stand taller and we see further. And we know what the Russians really think or what they should think. And what they think and say they think just doesn't matter that much. And when you're operating on those kinds of lines of thought, you're going to get yourself into a lot of trouble. And that's why we're in a lot of trouble, not just in Ukraine, but in the Middle East as well.
That were the great words of the wise, really wise men. And I would say that I would certify that 2005, I was in Washington speaking with Mr. Brzezinski, Mr. Zbigniew Brzezinski, and there was the chessboard, the real chessboard in front of us, between us, and I have asked Mr. Brzezinski, do you think that the chess is the game for two players? He has said, no, it's for one. When I have called my book Great Eurasian Chessboard, Great Chessboard, I have meant precisely the logic of the game and not the quantity of the players. So there is only one player at the chessboard. That is to see, to be taller, to see further. That is attitude. Or that inspires the confidence that you are alone at the table of the global geopolitics. And when Putin popped up in that sense, and China popped up on the scene of this chessboard, that was insult, moral attack against this consciousness that the chess is the game for one player. That is unipolarity, not only on the geopolitical level, but as well as Mr. Mearsheimer has emphasized on the ideological level as well. So liberal democracy is unique, universal system of values, and the interests and values of the West are unique. So when someone appears on the other side of the chessboard, that is a scandal. We need to punish it immediately. We need to cut it. We need to destroy it. We need to bring the strategical defeat on Russia immediately, because the chess is the play a game for one. So I think that is completely irrealist attitude. So realism in international relations is based on the acceptance of the sovereignty. And if you accept the sovereignty, you accept the possibility, at least theoretically, to behave as you wish, because there is no other instance that could say, oblige you to behave in this way or another way. That is the nature of sovereignty. If you accept sovereignty, you accept the existence of other player, Chinese, Russian, maybe Muslim as well, as in the case of the Middle East, or Indian maybe, or African, Latin American. So we are dealing with the other subjects that are other than ourselves. That is very, very, very tragic, I think, that United States of America and the collective West in general lacks today this strategical approach. With existence or presence of this strategical approach, we could imagine much more easy solutions for some crises in the world that seem to be irresolvable. Accepting multiplicity or diversity of the players and civilizations, as Huntington has called it, I think everything will be much easier to solve.
So we are discussing in a framework that we are living under the dictatorship of American-led liberal democracy, and they're so full of themselves that they don't see how people from other parts of the world, leaders from other sovereign nations, may have a brain of their own. But is there also a possibility, and this is a question who a friend of mine gave me before the conversation started, and he's a proponent for liberal democracy. His question is that, are we sort of giving the United States too much credit that it is the master, the puppet master orchestrating behind it all? Is it also possible that the conflict in Ukraine is a result of the long history between Ukraine and Russia, between people living in the eastern part of Ukraine and the western part of Ukraine? Is it possible that it is a very local issue?
I will let Professor Dugin go first this time, since I've gone first in answering all the previous questions. I think it's only just that he have a chance to go first. And then I can respond.
So in my opinion, we could not reduce the importance of the Russian-Ukraine conflicts to regional scale. So that is geopolitical issue or the larger scale, because in the reality, the identity of Ukrainian nation is very recent. It is artificial and recent, because Ukraine never existed in history, and that was just the part disputed between Russian Empire and Poland and Austria and the West in general. So that was the frontier between two civilizations, and politically, Ukraine was liberated, first of all, from Turks, and that was Novorossiya or Eastern Ukraine. That was the territory that belonged to the Turks, to the Ottoman Empire, and not to some imagined Ukrainian state. There was nothing of sorts in the history. So that was the fight between two empires, Russian Empire and Ottoman Empire, for some frontiers, for some border zones, and Russia has won the control over what we are calling now Novorossiya, from Kharkov, that was the part of the other ancient region, to Odessa. That was the part of newly acquired or reacquired territories by Russian Empire from Turks. No Ukrainians were involved because they didn't exist in that situation. The western part of Ukraine was the same people, the same culture, the same religion, Orthodox, but the western part was, after the Mongols invasion, under influence of Lithuania and Poland, and partly later of Austria. And having the same, exactly the same identity, roots identity as ourselves, as Russian from Muscovite Russian, Eastern Russian, they were under control of the Polish Catholic and Austrian as well Catholic. But they conserved, Ukrainians fought for their Orthodox identity under the rule of the Catholic Poland and Austria. So we could not regard them as the part of the Western Europe as well. Western Ukrainians belong to the same root, to the same tree of our historical identity that fought against the Polish and against Western Europe. The experience to live some centuries under control of Catholic European nation that has made the impact, the influence over their identity. And in Lvov, Lemberg, and the most western city of the Western Ukraine, that is considered as a capital of all Western anti-Russian ideology, until recent times, there were two parties, pro-Moscovite and and Russophobic parties coexisted. There is the complex history of identities inside of Ukraine, and the unique way to save the newly established national state of Ukraine was to take in consideration both identities, pro-Russian Eastern identity and more or less, not so radically, anti-Russian identity of the Western Ukraine, to make a balance, to create a state as Belgium, for example, with Wallons and the Flemish people balancing each other with different linguistic identities, historical experience, and so on. So that was the chance, and they have lost. The Kiev regime has lost its chance, choosing only one identity, Western Ukraine, artificially created. Western Ukraine identity cleansed from pro-Moscovite Orthodox elements, to liberated from this part of the deep Ukrainian identity, and creating artificial pro-Western, pro-European Union, LGBT plus, globalist liberal identity, artificial, in order to fight against Eastern Ukraine and Russia. So in that sense, regional dimension of Ukrainian conflict, we could not discard, we could not forget. It exists, and it existed historically, because that was the history of the fight between the Great Russia, Moscow, against the West, the Western Europe. And the Ukraine was the frontier, the battlefield in the time of Peter the Great, before, and the time of Alexis Romanov. That was the battlefield until the Stalin's time, when the Western Ukraine was annexed to Soviet Union. So that was the eternal battlefield of Russia to expand our border to the West, or to diminish our influence in that orientations. That regional dimension really exists, but it doesn't explain everything, because when we consider the place of Ukrainian conflict on the geopolitical scale, on the global scale of the confrontation between unipolarity defended by globalists, not realists, in USA, and emerging multipolar world order, where Russia pretends to be sovereign pole, as well as China and other poles. So that, I think, regional aspect is the secondary, comparing with these global geopolitical level.
姐妹们总烦恼脸上细纹、干燥与暗沉，现在起跟我一起放心交给 KS Royal Face 皇家颜值逆时奇迹系列。KS Royal Face 皇家颜值逆时奇迹系列，它添加5种 EGF， 专门防止肌肤老化，强化皮肤修复，增加肌肤弹性水嫩，轻松抚平皱纹，换回青春自信。KS Royal Face 皇家颜值逆时奇迹，活肤露、全效精华、精华霜，即刻启动冻龄密码。